Welcome, everybody, to this historic Whiskey Row Speaker Series at number 15. Tonight, we have the privilege of being in an amazing building right here on Whiskey Row. This is housed distillers and whiskey. This has its own historic history right here. So this was actually the original building of W.L. Weller, and this is actually where Pappy Van Winkle got his start here before they moved out to their distillery. So this kind of has a good little culture for us to bring in a really, really special guest today. So, you know, Freddie always liked to write a little something. So, welcome to the Incredible Whiskey Row Speaker Series featuring a rising star in the whiskey industry. Tonight we have the privilege of hearing from Freddie Booker the Fourth, right? And also known as Little Book. Born into a legacy of bourbon craftsmanship. I'll eventually get it here, Freddie. Dating back 8 generations, Freddie's emerged as the master distiller with Jim Beam. From his early days of exploring Jim Beam Distillery to his inventive creations like the Little Book Collection, Freddie embodies the perfect blend of tradition and innovation. So please join me in welcoming 8th generation Freddie Little Book. No. How are you, Freddie?
I'm good. What about you, Chris?
Man, I'm good. You know, every time I've done this gets fancier and fancier up here.
I like that. It does. It looks nice.
This time
it's one of the fancier I've had. I'll say.
They wrote us some. They wrote us some like names of everyone that we're doing here.
I like the air quotes though.
Did you like the air quotes?
Or are the quotes? Sorry, they're not air quotes.
Oh no, they are actually quotes. They are quotes
on paper.
So let's talk a little bit about what we're actually pouring back there for everybody tonight. So a couple of the things that we're pouring the Knob Creek Single Barrel Selection, which was actually done by number 15. Freddie and I actually got to have a little bit of that upstairs.
Yeah.
It's pretty good, wasn't it? Yeah.
I kind of saved a little bit of mine because I didn't know we were gonna have glasses up here. Sometimes I go to tastings, they don't even give me glasses, so I thought.
You go to a tasting and they don't give you any whiskey?
Well, everybody else gets it, and I just got to talk about it. I'm like, hell, I need some whiskey. So,
Freddie, you would think that when you do stuff with me, we're gonna give you whiskey.
I should have known that.
Going forward, we know that going forward.
Hey, I came prepared either
That's
way,
right. You came prepared. You came prepared in many ways, but we're not going to talk about that yet. So, the other things that we're pouring is the Booker's Mighty Fine Batch. Has anybody had that yet? Yeah? The prices are fantastic here. I think we're $10 a pour for the 1 ounce pour of that. And then we have the Booker's Storyteller Batch. And then we also have one of my favorites that we're pouring tonight, the Baker's 13-year single barrel, and that is just
that's one of my favorites as well.
Yep.
I love that.
So before we get into a lot of our questions, do you have a favorite, a favorite rendition that you've ever had of Beam just over your years? Is there one that's always popped out? Special batch?
Yeah, there's so one of my dad's friends found they used to steal Jim Beam Black from my grandfather when they were in high school, I guess maybe. High school. Let's go with that. I know it was. And, we obviously has had a few renditions over the years from 101 months, 90 proof, down to 8 years old, down to 86 proof. And so essentially, he had procured a bottle basically back from when they were, actually it was in 78, so they would have been 21. So it was, I guess, a legal drink for them then as well. But it was 101 months, 90 proof, Beam's Black Label from 1978. And just, being there with my dad's friend who actually works with us at the distillery, a couple of my buddies, a couple of their buddies, it was a pretty cool experience. So I'd say that's probably my favorite pour ever.
Still got any left?
Well, we got a few bottles. We ended up buying a few. He knew a guy and he had like a case, so we ended up buying the whole case. But come by, we'll crack into one.
Oh, that's what I'm talking about. That was for me only, just to let everybody know. That wasn't to the crowd. That was just me and Freddie talking. He's not inviting everybody out. So just to put that out. So Freddie, a couple, I guess it was like last Thursday night. You guys, I don't know if you follow a lot of things that happened at number 15, but if you don't know what happened at number 15 last Thursday, they had, I think it was called Magic Hunks. Was that what it was called, Josh? Yeah? That's how I got Freddie here, as I told him I was going to have him dance for the Magic Hunk show.
Yeah, I was just a little disappointed.
And so he was a little ticked off when he came in. Sorry, man, next time.
I thought this was the second round of that. But
yes, but they're gonna do it again. They said you're invited. Okay. So if you want to come back and see Freddie dance at the Magic Hunk show, he'll be here. So, Freddie, let's start out just a little bit of the Beam history. So one of the things that I think is so fascinating, if you don't know a lot about the Beam history, is the Beam family's pretty much, and he could correct me if I'm wrong, pretty much been making whiskey since we have been a country. That's pretty incredible statistics.
I would say, I mean, we were making whiskey in America before it was a country, but in Kentucky specifically, the U.S. was 19 years old, so that's one of the kind of jokes was that the country couldn't really have a legal drink.
Couldn't have a drink.
Yeah.
So talk about that. So how did Beam get started?
Essentially, it came through a military land grant. They were giving out land grants to come to this area to grow corn. Jacob's essentially cousin and uncle fought in the Continental Army and received this opportunity. And Jacob's uncle took it, but then I guess essentially kind of passed. So it was divided amongst some of the folks that were there. And why Jacob kind of got connected in with his uncles and cousins was his father passed when he was 6 years old. His dad was 29. They were in Pennsylvania. It's kind of where our family landed. And his mother was 16 and essentially moved back to her brother's farm, family farm, to kind of get some support, right? A couple young kids, a young lady. And so that's kind of how he got into it. And really, we've always said that's how he learned how to make whiskey, was through his uncle, Jost Myers would be his name, in Maryland, most likely. And then as Jost kind of divided up, because Jacob was part of the family, he had a chance to come to Kentucky. So a handful of Beams came. And
this is early 1800s?
This was 1787, I believe they left Maryland. And then 1795 kind of settled on the little spot in Hardin's Creek, Kentucky.
Wow. And then immediately just built a distillery? And
well, I think it's interesting. You know, we got the prop here, but what's unique about
we were gonna wait a little longer to discuss it.
We don't have to say anything else.
Yeah, there's nothing here.
Okay, yeah. But like the thing sitting here, at that time, whiskey was more of just a farm task. So everybody was making whiskey in America because you were growing grain to feed your animals, to feed your family. And whiskey, they quickly became a commodity because you could preserve the grain. You could turn grain into whiskey, and it basically kept forever. So it was a very strong bartering item, but also it was it kind of, again, kept your feet alive. So that's what it started as. And then somewhere along the way, Jacob probably was not there. It was probably his son David. Jacob was still alive from what we believe, but that's where it really became more about kind of making whiskey and farming versus just farming, and whiskey kind of being really a byproduct of living. That's kind of what I say is if you watch that TV show, it's kind of based off of Yellowstone, but it's like them going to Yellowstone. It was like 1820, I think, or something. I don't know. Something like 1883.
We'll go with it. This isn't a historic.
But so essentially, same scenario, right? You got people on horseback going across the land, and it's just trying to survive was probably their biggest thing, right? It wasn't really marketing whiskey. That's what I always tell people. Like, what do you think Jacob's vision was? I said, to stay alive, I think, honestly.
That's a really good point. Like during that time, that was the main goal, wasn't it?
That's a lot of it, right? It was just, they were making whiskey. The family became good at it because he owned a mill. He did a lot of grinding of grain, in my opinion. So he saw different qualities of grain. And so as whiskey became more of a task than just a farm task, kind of equally as part of farming, I think the fact that he could grind grain for the local area, he knew what was good grain, what was bad grain. And so as he started making whiskey, the better the grain you have, the better quality of whiskey you have.
So you mentioned a little bit about the marketing and stuff like that. So how was that word of Jacob making whiskey getting out to the world, you think?
A lot of it was, and if you really just go back in history, people were making barrels, and even if you worked for somebody, you would write your name on the barrel because that's how you got paid at the end of the day. It's like Chris filled 12. Of course, Freddie filled 15. Just kind of say a little bit more than you, right?
I understand.
Just kidding, but in reality, right? So Chris would get paid for what he filled. I would get paid for what I filled in that day. And really, if you kind of go back, that's how it was all letters. People would write letters, but a lot of it was people were asking for the whiskey called Beam, and it was from Bourbon County. So they would say, we want more of those Beam barrels from Bourbon County. And that's kind of how it got going.
That kind of how it got its name,
Yeah,
Beam, or is
yeah.
and that's how it kind of.
I mean, honestly, the first marketed, and if you say marketed product, was actually Old Tub, which stood for Old Mash Tub, which it's kind of funny when marketers, not in the family, kind of joined the company. That was one of the first things they said is, that's not a very appealing name. And then it
Tub
became...
Didn't sound like anything when
Yeah.
drink anybody's Old Tub whiskey.
So it didn't really switch to Beam until after Prohibition. And it was more Jerry who, in honor of his dad and the time, as we talked about a little bit earlier, about during Prohibition and that comeback, the honor of his father was to name the product Jim Beam.
Okay. So when did, so I have, James Beam took over kind of around like 1890-ish.
Yeah, late 1800s.
So what happened with Jacob to that point there?
So Jacob stayed there at Hardin's Creek. His son David did as well. Went from about 100 acres to 800, so just kind of grew the farm. And by the time we left there, it was a whiskey business as much as it was a farm. And there was a newly established railroad coming through Nelson County, and David's son, David M., saw some land that was adjacent to this railroad, built a railroad station there, a stop, and then built a distillery there. And so then the railroad stop was Beam. So then you got more people asking for whiskey from Beam, and someone said, well, how did that, what was your advantage in that? I said, well, if you run the railway stop and you're getting letters asking for whiskey, are you going to sell the whiskey that's yours there, or the ones that, again, I'll say, Chris dropped some whiskey off. We need to move these barrels down south or north. Well, we're going to get rid of ours first, you know. And I think that was a lot of it, was we made good whiskey, and that opportunity to kind of put it anywhere when whiskey was being asked for because we had a railway stop.
Yes, that's really interesting because we talked about the really the importance of this kind of building in Whiskey Row here, and the biggest importance is that we were next to the Ohio River, next to the wharf where we could go through and transfer barrels. So that's kind of was leading into my question of being in Bardstown and being the really no way to really transport. So that was what it was. The railroad comes in, starts getting, and you're able to throw some.
So yeah, Jacob was moving across the river essentially, right, and taking long treks. He wasn't. The whiskey was taking longer treks down south through the riverway, essentially. But yeah, it allowed us to be more expansive in how the whiskey, where it was going and how it was getting out there was quicker as well. So it was to me, I think it's one of the more least talked about points, but probably very pivotal points in our whiskey history was being at that spot where the name Beam resonated with barrels of whiskey from the railway, but also the barrels that were being shipped were Beam predominantly barrels as well. So it was a little bit of a double thing there that
it's kind
helped
of true.
us
That's kind of
out
how the railroad coming through is kind of where the downfall of Whiskey Row and this area kind of went through for one time because the railroad was much faster to get whiskey everywhere. There's no real reason to travel it down the Ohio anymore.
That's a very good point.
So very interesting. So James Beam takes us into Prohibition.
Yep.
So Prohibition, 1920 to 1933, and Beam shut down.
Yep.
No whiskey production that we know of any type. Beam shut down, and we were talking a little bit about it upstairs, was that Beam very religious, so saw it coming a long time before and just made the decision to shut the distillery down.
So his daughter, she was married, had no children, widowed, lived in the house my dad lives in now, which was Jim Beam's house. When she got elderly, my dad kind of helped take care of her because she had no children, kind of close aunt. She always said that Papa was scared to go to jail. That's what she called him, Papa. Was scared to go to jail, as I was mentioning to you. He was very religious. Wanted nothing to do with kind of the idea of people coming down and maybe under the table buying barrels illegally, and didn't want to go to jail. So he basically sold the farm. That's what my dad always asked her too, was how the hell do you sell a distillery when Prohibition's coming about? And it was the farm was the value, right? He sold the farm, and oh, by the way, there's a distillery over there if you want to use it, right? But that's kind of what it was about. It wasn't about, hey, we got a nice shiny distillery to sell. That was going away. He did end up buying a defunct distillery, which is where we sit now in Claremont. It was the old Murphy and Barber distillery, but it had been shut down for about 10-ish years prior to Prohibition, so it was already kind of known as you're not going to really get anything out of that spot, so no really reason for the kind of mobsters from Chicago and New York to come in there and look for barrels. It looked like a decrepit spot.
And he bought that during Prohibition.
Bought that really right as Prohibition hit, right in 1920. Okay. And quarried, it was a rock quarry already set up there. So essentially, he brought a rock quarry. And he did, yeah. Okay. A lot of the limestone rock that sits around our campus today was quarried by him during that time and really laid in by him. So he ran the rock quarry, and like I was saying earlier, I think he was probably sweeping the broom, straightening things up, getting the distillery ready. Another thing that Dad always said, Aunt Mimi said to him, was they never believed that there was any chance in hell that it would last 13 years. You know, it just blew their minds that Prohibition stuck around
last that long.
Yeah, they thought, one term of presidents, to be honest with you, it would be the thing that did it.
And they just kept going with the rock quarry.
Just kept going with the rock quarry. Had some coal mining opportunities in eastern Kentucky, and then also had a citrus farm in Florida. But I think, again, right, even though it's progressed to a place where you can get around a little bit, it's not like today where you could hop on a plane and go check out your citrus farm. He lost a lot of money at that. He was just trying. He also had a lot of allergies, is why he would go to Florida for periods of time to kind of clear his allergies out. But that was part of it, was he had that. But he's only here 3 months. We can
he's trying to stay alive.
Correct, right?
I mean, it's just a little different time period.
So he lost a lot of money, really, through rock quarrying and citrus farming, and really coming out of Prohibition to get to that. He was 70 years old. Had a lot of nickels is kind of what was said, and there was a few folks that invested in the distribution of whiskey before Prohibition. They were calling him. They thought he had money, so they were going to kind of hopefully get together and get. He thought they had money, and so they didn't really have much together.
Nothing to
they kind of pulled it together and got it going. Essentially, the Blooms and the Kovlers were the two. They were cousin families there, and that's kind of how it got going. And what's interesting to me about that is, Jerry Beam comes after that. His son Jerry, who had no children as well, but he was a young boy, 13 or 14, when Prohibition hit. And I just think about this: 13 or 14, you got 13-year Prohibition. That'd be 26, 27, maybe 28. I couldn't imagine my dad telling me, "Hey, man, let's get this distillery going." Coming
at 14 years old, yeah.
Well, no, at 14, he wouldn't have known much about whiskey, right? So then it was done. Right. He probably had a job doing something else, and then Prohibition's repealed, and Jim Beam's got to convince his son that, hey, this is still a good idea for our family to do, right? That's what's always was interesting to me.
For most of.
Right, like 50% of his life, whiskey was prohibited.
Interesting. So 1933, he comes. He's talked to him like, let's make this distillery again. With
a lot of help of cousins as well. That's where our cousin Baker, that name Baker's namesake, that's where his family comes in. Is his grandfather, or excuse me, his father was really helping Jerry and Jim coming out of Prohibition.
And so we have 1933, we're out of Prohibition, and 1933 to about 1970s, it's about the time that White Label gets introduced, from the 1970s, right?
That was the White Label was introduced in around probably like 38, 39, in a way, yeah. Old Tub was around for a while as well, but it actually died in the 70s, but we kind of started to really try to market Beam coming right out of Prohibition. And what's kind of unique about Jerry's time is he was really relied on people like my granddad and Baker to run the distillery and make the family whiskey, right, that mattered. He liked to travel and was really a visionary for taking whiskey into these other countries. So I think he was really credited with about almost 70 countries across his tenure there of really, Jim Beam stepped away in like 1943. So from like 1943 to that time, like 68, I believe. Okay. He took us into about 68 or 69 countries, almost 70 countries.
Wow.
And a lot of it was he had a lot of respect for military, and during this time was the World Wars, Vietnam, a lot of conflict, right? He would get letters asking for, we drank Jim Beam at home. We can't get that on our base. And he would just send pallets of whiskey to these military bases.
Kind of want that feeling of home.
Yeah, exactly.
That whiskey from back home.
Exactly. Some of our older employees tell me, they were stationed in Germany, and Jim Beam's huge in Germany still today, Australia. A lot of these places where a lot of our military were based has been where some of our more prominent growth has been, but that's kind of how and why. Yeah.
But so then we get to the 1970s and 80s, kind of where whiskey kind of takes a little bit of a tumble.
Yeah.
And I asked this to Julian too, and yet, your family still stays in it, which had to have been just as hard of a time.
Yeah.
When nobody, for you guys who don't know, that whiskey was what your dad drank, and the country just kind of stopped drinking a lot of brown spirits and went to a lot of clear spirits of gins and vodkas and stuff like that. And
my dad always says James Bond was probably our biggest rival.
He did a good job.
He did, yeah.
Like 12 movies later, and I guess that hurt. So you all make the decision to really keep and stay in whiskey. And who was spearheading that at that time to keep going at it?
A lot of it was my granddad. Like I said, Jerry was really probably at the kind of peak of the growth. Really, I think up until recent history, 1968 was like the highest peak of our prominence of whiskey. And then to your point, it kind of tumbled quickly thereafter and then rose again as we know now. But Granddaddy was really kind of tinkering and doing a lot of things during this time. We'd shut the distillery down about 50% of the year during this downfall. People that worked in the distillery become the yard cutters, the landscapers, just to keep them on the payroll, right? We didn't want to lose our employees. So they would do other tasks, bottling part of the year as well. But really during that time, it allowed him to experiment in the distillery as we were maybe coming up or going down, or just free time, some extra grain sitting around. And it really got to where in what we're at today was spurred from Granddaddy's kind of downtime or idle time in the distillery, where he could create things like Booker's and talk about a little bit different distillation, straight from the barrel proof, and a different flavor. A lot of it was they were trying to take things like Jim Beam, the mainstream whiskeys that were known in the 60s, and make them lighter to try to compete with James Bond's cocktails, and make them more like clear spirits, and probably more at a detriment to the overall longevity of American whiskey, right? As the flavor was gone, and so then it gave Granddaddy
watered down.
It was watered down, right? And young. I still say Jim Beam's the world's #1 selling bourbon. And really, it was the standard of American whiskey for so long, and it's 4 years old and 80 proof. So it's like it's come a long way in a short period of time. That's kind of the moral of the story there. But that tinkering time he had because of the downturn of whiskey allowed him to deliver more flavor in the distillate, allowed him to kind of start hand-picking these unique pockets of barrels that were a little bit older. It gave us decanters as well. Nobody wanted dark whiskey. They knew that was going to be not vodka, right? So let's put it in.
Let's hide it.
Yeah, let's hide it.
Let's hide it.
And they'll buy that fancy thing to sit on their shelf.
Because that looks prettier. I remember my grandparents had tons
Right, they had a
of
bunch of them,
decanters. Tons. They were all empty, but they drank it still.
Somebody did. They snuck drinks out of them, right?
There's still some of those out there still today,
That's how we got rid of the 6, 8, 10-year-old whiskey, was through decanters and things like that. And then someone asked, is there anything laying around here, Booker, we could... they hated the idea of giving away chocolates for Christmas gifts to like partners and vendors. So this one guy was like, we make whiskey. Is there any kind of differentiated whiskey we could give folks to, just as a thank you, right, as a business partner? So he's like, well, there's this. And he opened his drawer and pulls out a bottle of Booker's, but it wasn't Booker's at the time, just a bottle of whiskey he'd been tinkering with, as he would call it. And this guy was, again, he's a marketing guy from Chicago, and he tasted this 7-year-old cask strength whiskey.
Say barrel-proof whiskey.
Barrel-proof whiskey.
Booker's.
And I guess it was probably a 50-50 shot, right? But he was like, holy shit, this is really good. Let's do this. Can we bottle this up?
Barrel print that's absolutely 50-50
Yeah, exactly. Right. So that was it. You know, they bought some wine bottles because they were cheap to procure at the time, used an old crock pot to wax dip it, and then Granddaddy kind of hand wrote the label as a letter to say, this is kind of how our family likes the whiskey, a little bit older, a little bit higher proof. What do you all think about this? And it's kind of funny. The ones that opened it loved it and said, we need to sell this shit. What is this gift? You know, we put this in the distribution. Yeah. And then the other half were, can you send us another one? We love Booker. He's such a great man to know that he created this, and it's the only bottle. I'm not going to open this. So they had to end up sending quite a few extra bottles out just because people weren't going to drink it because they
collecting that.
Respected Booker but didn't want to taste the whiskey he had made.
So I was just kind of thinking, do you know about how many barrels kind of between that 70 or 80 that they were maybe laying down a day or anything like that? I was just kind of maybe trying to compare.
In the 70s
yeah,
and
80s? Yeah, the 70s, 80s time period to
probably
where we
about,
are now?
Probably in ratio aspect, maybe a quarter, roughly, maybe a little bit more than, so maybe probably not quite a third, somewhere between a quarter.
And what about are we doing?
So they're probably doing about 600 barrels a day. You can do the math there. I'm not.
That's a lot. Oh, I can't do that.
Corporate might give me a little smack, but yeah.
But that's unbelievable.
Quite a bit, yeah.
It's a little bit more of a production than a 70s.
Yeah.
Just a tad. So we're to the present, 1980s to now. Jim Beam has become the largest producer of whiskey.
Yeah.
Bourbon whiskey. We're going to say bourbon or just whiskey?
I would say that's a good. I don't. So many people are
depends
expanding
on the number
today
and stuff like that.
Day
Depends on what day that we say it.
Yeah.
So, but we do know one of the largest producers of whiskey in the world.
Yeah.
To where we are today, we've gone through the bourbon boom and things like that, and how. So we're kind of coming into your time here.
Yeah.
And so that's where I want to say, when did you know that you wanted to do whiskey? Was it from because you were in the family business? Did you know? Did you want to do something else?
I mean, I think if there's if you see people take an interest in something your family's doing, there's naturally like this gravitation to want to do it or be a part of it. So I would say there was always this understanding that, hey, that's probably kind of cool. But really, my granddad pushed my dad way away from it. My dad just kind of let it float around for me. Didn't really talk about it a lot. At times would mention it as an opportunity.
Did they want you to go into it?
I guarantee it.
Yeah, they did.
I'd say looking back now, Dad was probably like, yes, yes, he finally came. I know that's how Granddaddy was with him. It was like, damn, that dumbass, he got his shit together. That's what he called him at a lot, and that's what Dad says. I thought that was my nickname for quite a few years.
Nickname or name?
Or name, yeah, name. But yeah, I was probably, I don't know, my granddad passed when I was 16, and him and I were very, very close, and it's very interesting. He probably did something he shouldn't have done, but at the same time, I'm glad he did, was give me comments about significant people in life or that I may encounter in life even, that just commentary on, hey, do what's right for you. You could do a good thing in this industry. And I didn't really know what he was meaning. But it's always do what you think is the right thing to do. And I didn't really understand why he was saying all this, but obviously, right, if I was to say, nah, I don't want to do that, at some point somebody probably would have came from the company and said, are you sure you don't want to try to, yeah. But so just those conversations, and then after he passed, so many people came and paid their respects from all over the world, really. And I still meet people to this day. In Japan, there's a fellow there that has, I would say, probably the most respect of anyone I've personally met through travel for my granddad, just through how he embraced him when he came to learn whiskey in the early 90s. It still just almost brings himself to tears talking about my granddad to me. And so just hearing a lot of those stories, it showed me that, a little bit. I was like, damn, I thought he was special to me, you know, but he was special to a lot of people, you know. So it kind of knocked me a little bit. But at the same time, I just thought it was so cool that they cared about him to come to that. And then as you start to ask your dad questions, I asked Dad, you know, just certain things. He gave me a book to read called American Still Life, which is an overview of our family's history by Paul Pocket. And so it really started to let me understand that Jim Beam was more than a family member, it was more than whiskey, and it was this long thing. And so I was probably still in high school, but there was always this part of me that I got shitty grades, and my dad did as well, and he wanted me to get good grades, and we just... I just didn't get it. I didn't get the good grade, so he was gonna beat in my head. You've got to get better grades. You've got to pass school to get to this. I always just thought school was a distraction to me making whiskey. That's how I looked at it when I was in college. But then once I
can just get through the school thing.
Right, literally, that's how I felt about it. But then once I kind of figured that it was an obstacle I wasn't going to get around, I had to go over or through, I started getting good grades, and gosh damn, I'll tell you what, he's one of my best friends today. It just changed, you know, he wanted me to do better than I was doing, and really, he knew I could do better. But I wanted to be the fun guy. I wanted to have fun, right? I didn't give a damn about school or class.
College,
right, exactly. Exactly. But so I guess part of that rebellious was, well, I'm not doing that with you. Why would I want? And it make him even more furious, I'm sure. But yeah, once it kind of all fell together, I knew that it was cool to be able. I really like history and just reading things and learning, knowledge. I just like learning. So to know that I could know so much about my family's history, share that story like we have here, to me, I thought it was just cool as shit. And really, one of my best friends passed in a car wreck when I was 19, and his mom said, as long as you boys keep those stories of Josh alive, he's alive with you all. And so I've kind of taken that into like, as long as we're talking about Jacob, Jim, Booker, and I'm telling these stories, they're as much a part of what we're still doing today as me. So I've just kind of at least leaned into that kind of sentiment of that. Yeah, yeah.
So what was your first job? Because you've done almost all of the jobs in the distillery, right? What was your first job in whiskey?
First job, well, I did an internship in marketing, actually, before I was finished with school. So that was my first official job. Corporate people probably get mad if I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I was kind of given a mentor. I met him on a Tuesday. We had lunch with the rest of the team on Wednesday, and on Thursday, himself and 30% of the office were let go. A little reorg. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I'm like day 3 intern. So I call my dad, and I'm like, Dad. His name was JJ. I said, JJ got let go. Really? Keep your head down. You don't want to get fired, because he had heard that they were like, it's like, you don't want to be the first intern that gets reorged out in the first week. But so it was like what I'll say, like an ice bath into corporate America. But I think very good because it kind of helped me understand how the business works,
Yeah, because you could have just been a master distiller but didn't know the whole marketing aspect of it and everything else that goes into it and building the barrels. And, I mean, you've done a little bit of all of it to where you are now, right? And then that, I have to fast forward because, I mean, you and I could sit up here and talk all day long.
Oh, yeah.
But I got to fast forward to what you're doing now. A couple years ago, brand new distillery opened up. And name of that distillery is named after
my dad,
Booker, right?
No, my dad.
No, it was after your dad. That's right.
Fred, it's just called the Fred B. No Distillery.
So Fred B. No Distillery, and that's kind of your baby, right?
Yeah, it's really, I'll say, the catalyst for what I'll call the future of American whiskey. I think the team I've kind of been assembling there and the work we're doing and the passion they have for it is pretty high as well, and myself included. But going in and like focusing on why does this Knob Creek 15 taste like this? Why does Booker's taste the way it does? and then understanding that to a point of how do we take those things and make something better, or how do we take those things and make them a better version of
like
themselves.
analyzing and isolating these pieces of these whiskeys to kind
Well, a little bit of it, but I'll say I always say science, you got to use it as a grain of salt, because there's plenty of things that are anomalies in whiskey, and I think when you're, especially to get to maybe the prop a little bit, the way we make whiskey, I think that's why I like to bring a ham with me. It's still very much just like that preservation. It's preservation of flavor today. We use the philosophy of yeast, which is propagated on site and controlled by the distiller. That's the backbone of your whiskey. Fermentation is done by grain. That's the only thing that's required to make whiskey. And natural water. There's very much a lot of good nutrients in Kentucky limestone water. And a lot of the site choosing of where we made whiskey was because of the pristine water source. So to me, growing up watching my granddad cure hams and preserve meat to share later is very much a close signal to how we still make whiskey. It's about being in touch with nature, being in touch with history and family, and preserving those things, because there is a lot of what I'll say modern technology that can make whiskey very, very easy. But if you want to call yourself a whiskey maker, I think there's things you have to hold on to, and curing ham is the thing for me that makes me stay true to this kind of family way of making whiskey.
I love it. So we actually didn't know that he was going to bring a ham. It was actually told to us a couple minutes ago. He's like, yeah, Freddie's bringing a ham. I said, okay, why is Freddie bringing a ham?
Well, the best part is why they thought I was bringing a ham initially was we have a thing called a ham luge, where before I cut this into this shape to be able to serve, and I will say after we're done, I'll set it on the bar back there, and if y'all would like to try it, I'd be glad to share a taste. There's a little cap that sits right here, and you slice that off to start revealing it. Well, our chef carved a little luge channel in the middle of it, and we poured Bookers down it, and it actually brings flavor into the whiskey. It really does, I promise that. And the fellow, the last time he's seen me, when I texted him that I work with him, Cole, I said, hey, Cole, I'm going to bring a ham. His only vision of me with ham, or most recent vision of me with ham, was holding that piece of luge and shooting whiskey. So I don't know, were you disappointed that it wasn't the luge and was the actual ham?
Not really. I mean, I actually got to eat the ham upstairs, so it's fun. He immediately brought it out. He said hi. He said nothing else. He immediately brought the ham out, because I thought it was a joke. And he brought it out, and sure enough, he set this whole entire thing, and he starts carving it up there, and that's what we started eating. So
yeah,
might have been why we were a couple minutes late.
It was
Freddie's fault. He was carving ham up there. But I can also say this has been, I've done a lot of whiskey talks in my years of being in whiskey. It's the first time I've sat up here, and it has smelled phenomenal this whole entire time. I'm like, this smells great. Yeah. It's really good. Every whiskey series, like, I'm gonna have to have somebody bring.
They gotta bring. You gotta set the bar high, right? I tried.
Let's talk a little bit about everything you're doing there, and how important is innovation in whiskey today, and what we're doing in innovation, and also like keeping with tradition as well. Because I think that there is that thin line to walk there, and you're doing a really good job. So what do you think about innovation in whiskey and bourbon today?
I think part of innovation is history as well, right? Like if you look at things that are cool again today, some of them were cool before. So I think what is unique about innovation is just really focusing on the craft of what you're doing. That's what I do. My family's done it for a long time. I have a lot of resources, my dad, and history to kind of like bounce these thoughts off of and see what's done good, what's not. There's some things that maybe got neglected in the history that resurrecting them today will bring good flavor to whiskey. And we've started doing some of that actually. So I think history can be a good tool to help you measure where innovation maybe should go. Like you can buy barrels or make a barrel out of damn near anything, right? Of wood, I should say. I should say damn near anything. Right? I guess you could. A wooden barrel you can make out of damn near any type of wood. but how long will it hold the whiskey? What will the flavor be that it adds to it? Some things you just don't do, you know. And that's how I think some of it is just doing things to do it, where I really focus on why would we do that? What is the value to Knob Creek to have a 15-year-old single barrel selection? What's the value to Booker's to tell stories? Well, he was literally a walking reality TV show before that existed. So he has a lot of stories about his life that should be told. Things like that, right? And then lean into those aspects. And it's just funny how if you kind of open up the conversation, that everything's open-ended, that there's no wrong answer, but you lead with factual information and things that are relevant, how the creativity really channels into the place it needs to. And I think that's what's so unique about how I kind of approach innovation. But to your point, innovation, what I'll say is Granddad creating small batch was innovation. It was 35, almost 40 years ago now. Now it's just part of the industry,
part of
right?
An industry, yeah. The term.
But to keep bringing people into whiskey, that's what our family, I think, has done. And you mentioned, why would your family keep making whiskey during Prohibition or even in the downturn in the 60s? I listened to an interview of my granddad, and they said, what do you think is, if you want the Beams to be known for something, what do you think it is? And he said that we're stick-to-it people. We stick to what we know, and we stand by that.
Resiliency.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of the kind of testament to our family's whiskey making and really kind of how I go about doing innovation even is stick to what you know and just own that and really dive in. And you can find ways to innovate within guardrails of brands that have existed for almost 200 years, all the way to things like Little Book, where one of the questions that I think is interesting is that I ask myself a lot is, how do you, as the 8th generation, doing something that everybody that you, like as yourself, right? I'm a master distiller, the 8th generation. So to your all's eyes, I'm the 8th person to kind of do this thing, right?
Yeah.
Well, how do I do it as Freddie No? And it starts as that, right? It's like you do it your way, and you start really leaning into a lot of the things that you learn, right, from those people before you. And the next thing you know, you've carved your own kind of path. And if you would have told me at 19 years old, you're not going to release a bourbon, you're going to release a blended whiskey first, I'd be like, you're a dumbass.
I work for a bourbon company.
Right. My family's known for bourbon. But that, I think Little Book is just such a testament to, and even, not to do a spoiler, but the next batch name is called Path Not Taken. And I think even though I took a path that maybe looks very beaten from the outside, I chose to take it in a way that was a different version. And I think that kind of shows up through Little Book and some of the things that we'll continue to be doing.
And you stuck out your first Little Book with the Easy about 6-7 years ago.
Seven. So well, almost. Yeah. So it was in 2017. Actually,
7 years
2017.
ago.
Yeah.
And that was kind of you're paying kind of homage to your grandfather too, of like this old way of getting whiskey, barrel strength, just kind of like. How it was back in the day, just come in almost like bring your jug, fill it up, and
that
go.
was the premise of Booker's, right? He thought that whiskey was meant to be that way, and so when he bottled Booker's uncut straight from the barrel, it was the first bottled cask strength. Me and Dad think spirit. I don't know that vodka did cask. There was no such, right? Like
no real thing.
There's not even a thing. So. Or maybe a rum that we don't know, but there was no Scotch. Booker's was the original cask strength whiskey or spirit. And so when I started working on Little Book, I was working on trying to develop a blended whiskey that could pay homage to bourbon through the elements of it in the whiskeys. And through me telling the team how unique the blend was and how it was doing that, one of the packaging engineers mentioned he was reading my granddad's book and how he called me Little Book. And he's like, you're talking so much like what your granddad was saying with Booker's and how his vision for that was. Why don't you call that Little Book? That was your nickname, right? And it never even crossed my mind. And so that stuck. And then we were talking about, what's the proof going to be? And I was much of, let's let the whiskey tell us when the blend is right, what the proof is going to be.
So saying 86 to get a couple extra bottles out of it.
Yeah. So then it came to, well, this is really good at cask. It's about that. If I'm going to do something different, why would I give it to you at a place that you couldn't enjoy it literally any damn way you wanted, right? You can enjoy it at cask all the way to 80 if you want to try it like Little Book Jim Beam style, right? And so that once the name Little Book stuck, as we went into that next development session, it was like, this is just going to stay cask strength because that's what the people deserve in this, in my opinion.
Did you get any pushback on that?
Oh, hell yeah. Well, people were like, are you
strength.
sure you want to, that was almost like, are you sure you want to have people compare it to Booker's? You know what I mean? Because it was called Little Book. The packaging was getting similar as we were.
Because of the black box.
It ended up getting very similar, but even before, it was still in that realm. So they were like, are you sure you want to do a blended whiskey and try to go toe-to-toe with your granddad? And I'm like, well, he would probably laugh and say, I've always been going toe-to-toe with him since I was a little bitty kid. But it wasn't about that, right? Like, I got to a place where I really enjoyed making that whiskey. I didn't give a damn what anybody said.
You enjoyed it.
And then everybody that I let try it, Jimmy Russell was one of the first kind of non-company people. He kind of fucked with me and said, oh, I've already had this. What is this? And I'm like, the hell you have? This is a slick bottle I brought with me straight from my office, you know. And
did you get in an argument with him for a second?
well, I walked off.
Like that.
Well, he said it. He's like, it's okay. And then I walked off. We were at our individual booths, and I walked off, and I come back. And he was just laughing his ass off. And he's like,
just thinking the biggest name in whiskey,
got
and he
you.
just said it's
Yeah.
okay.
He's like, I got you, didn't I? And he was like, what? So then he was like, what is it? And I was like, gosh, damn it. I thought maybe Fred had snuck him a sample because he knew I was doing it, you know. And so I was a little distraught that Jimmy had tried it, and I didn't get to see the reaction. But I went back, he said, you did a really good job. Your granddad would be very proud. So I was kind of, it's funny because it's, you know, he always calls himself my dad's dad on the road. Because Booker got a little bit bad health before Jimmy. Obviously, Jimmy's still doing really well.
Killing
right?
it,
So,
man.
yeah. He kind of said, watch Fred out there for me too, Jimmy. So then when I started traveling, and then it was funny, Fred and Eddie started seeing each other, and then Jimmy and I'm like, is Fred making Jimmy kind of circle back on me, or what the hell's the deal here? I run into Jimmy in random cities. And he'd just be sitting over there, and he'd say, I'm watching you, and then he's like, the difference between me watching you and me watching your dad is I'm not going to report back to your dad. So it was just kind of funny how he just made that connection with me and made me felt a part of the industry. I was 27, 28 when he started kind of poking at me, I guess I would say. But so it was kind of funny, right? But then even then he was like, it was good whiskey. So I knew it was good what was in the glass, so I wasn't concerned about people comparing it to Booker's or
It was kind of your salute to Booker's and stuff like that a little bit, because you weren't trying to straight compete. You almost kind of, like putting him on a pedestal.
Well, you could argue, some would say maybe you could look at it that way, or you could say it was like trying to be something totally different, right, at the same time. So I think people always say, what do you think your granddad would say? I was nervous to answer it before, but I think he would be really proud just because of the opportunities that it's brought for me, for whiskey, for really our company, right, to be in different conversations than we were. I think he would 100% be behind
You
that.
also brought this amazing, innovative spirit, too, to a 200-year-old company. It's been making incredible whiskey for all this time, and put a little bit of your own
yeah, I think, you say a little.
Right?
It's funny. You ask some of my coworkers, they probably think that little, sometimes he overcranks that. They call it, I think they think I'm crazy sometimes. Like, where do you come up with some of this stuff? But, you wake up in the middle of the night and something pops in your head. It just stays there. And then it's like the first thing out of my mouth when I walk in the door, and they're like, can we have coffee together? Can we talk about,
Can we get somewhere first?
What else is going on?
All your crazy ideas.
We already have other things going on today. Why do we need something else to talk about?
So, brings me to one question, because we talked earlier, and I like to ask anybody who I ever talk in the whiskey industry this, because I like to put a couple like myths and stuff like that to bed in whiskey. And one of my favorite things is there a certain way that anyone should drink their whiskey?
Oh, yeah, that's my favorite question.
Is there a certain way, like tell everybody, is there a certain way they should drink
It's one of my
their
favorite
whiskey?
stories, because if you knew my granddad, maybe some of the whiskey had the influence on it, but if you and people probably say it about me a lot as well, but you just kind of get what's on the mind, comes out off the tongue, and that's how it is. But I think it leads to very transparent and open conversation.
Absolutely. That's why we drink while we do
Yeah,
this.
yeah. So he was doing something like this. He went through all four small batches, late in the evening, so he probably had a few before that. And a lady stood up and she said, I wish my son would have came, but he was ashamed to come listen to you speak because I told him I was going to ask this question. And it was essentially every night we have a drink, and he loves Bookers, and I love Bookers as well. But he says that you would not tell me to drink Bookers if you knew how I did it. And it was like, I drink Bookers and Coke, and he has Bookers neat. And she said, what do you think about that? And my dad was there, and he said, I swear I didn't know what the hell your granddad was going to say. You know, he could have ripped her a new one, right? Or
It's a terrifying question.
It
If you don't
is.
know whiskey to ask a master distiller.
well, especially with him, you know, it was probably what
Yeah, you don't know what's gonna come
What
off.
mood he was in. It could have been what was going to come out too. But he said, if you take the world's best whiskey and you mix it with Coke, you just made the world's best whiskey and Coke. And it's just something that we've
that deserves an applause right there.
It's kind of funny. It came full circle on me because we did Booker's Rye, as you know, a few years back. It won Whiskey of the Year.
It's an incredible bottle you can't find anymore. So thanks for
Yeah.
bringing that up. I appreciate it.
We had a handful of bottles that when we were running them on the line, a piece of equipment was ripping the batch label. So you couldn't write the number of the bottle, right? It was one that we individually numbered. And so it ripped that almost in two, like a divided. The plant manager said, hey, we've already shipped everything. We found, we found them over into the breakage as we were siphoning back through. Just take them to your house, and if, when you're having guests over, open one up and share it. That way you don't have to open one of the nice ones, right? You can use a...
It's very nice.
Yeah. So he gave me a case of them, 6 of them actually.
Those are really very nice.
And I just gave them to my dad to put in the locked whiskey cabinet. And coincidentally, we had a dinner, and there was an enormous amount of ginger beer that had been dropped off for this party. I guess they thought everybody was going to have 6 Kentucky Mules that was at the thing. They did not, and my mother was left with a pallet of ginger beer. Oh she asked our master mixologist, Bobby G, what's a cocktail to use up this damn ginger beer? How the hell do I drink it? So he taught her how to do Kentucky Mule with rye whiskey. Knob Creek rye, I will give Bobby credit. He made this with Knob Creek rye. You know where this is going already.
Oh, I already know where it's going.
But so, this is a kind of sidebar. I come into the garage where we had set one, and I see that, we'd had a couple drinks. It was significantly lower, like well below the label. And my dad was sitting there and said, damn, Dad, you get into the rye? Who's been over? I didn't touch it. So then I'm like, okay, there's not any kids. My daughter was maybe 5, 4. She's definitely not even, right, it was not her. It was not me trying to kind of say, ha, I wasn't, it wasn't like that anymore. Didn't need to hide it.
No, we're good.
Right, it was all good. So it was like, wow, the mystery of the Booker's Rye disappearance. But the mystery didn't last long. I said, well, then what the hell happened to it, Fred? What's your thought? Mine is it evaporated. He said, well, your mother,
Sure did.
Mom. My mom is not she likes Jim Beam Black, was one of her favorite kind of sipping whiskeys. She would not be drinking Booker's Rye. How you would probably particularly enjoy a very hard to find whiskey, right? So I'm like, oh, come on. She did, with ginger beer and lime juice.
Did it hurt you, Lem?
It hurt me. I was like, gosh, what the hell are we doing
So you can
here?
drink it however you want, unless it's the Booker's
I wanted
Rye.
to say, who the hell's in charge of the whiskey around here, Fred? What the hell? You let that shit
You
fly?
let her have that?
So honestly, we marched right in there. I'm like, I'm going to see this. So he follows me. Like, oh, this is going to be funny. Freddie's going to go get on his mother. This has worked out well 0 times before. So of course I want to watch from a distance. But she gets me real quick, I'll be honest. I like to be the guy that gets the ha-ha at the end, but she got me good.
Didn't work out for you this time.
I said, Mom, what the hell? We got Knob Creek Rye. We got Jim Beam Rye. What would your granddad say? I said, what do you mean? He said, enjoy it any damn way you please. So you can't say that. So I did. I just shut up and I walked away.
It was true.
But now I tell the story, and I think she kind of doesn't like it because people are like, you drank a ginger beer
with that rye.
Kentucky Mule. It's kind of like,
it's one of the best rides.
Yeah,
right.
So now when you run into my mom, you're going to have to say.
I will. Oh, absolutely. It's like, I wish I would have had a bottle of that.
Yeah.
I'd have drank it with
Well, I'll
ginger
tell you
beer
what,
with her.
she might still have a stash. So.
Oh, well, then we should come over. You guys aren't invited to that either. No, it was, again, just a personal invite for me. So, Freddie, we're getting close to our time, so I want to say thank you so much for joining us out here and agreeing to come out and do this. Did you guys enjoy Freddie up here tonight? Wonderful. If you want to meet him, talk to him, I'll have the ham over here to take a picture of the ham, because that's probably what everybody really wants to take a picture of, not you, Freddie.
Yeah, I would agree. It's the ham.
This is how you get people to come, is the ham.
I'm trying, right?
I get it.
It was the bottles of whiskey. Next time it'll be the ham.
one step at a time, man.
Yeah, get them there.
Again, thank you guys so much for joining us here at number 15. We will be back again next month for a great whiskey speaker series. Thank you guys very much. Big hand for Freddie. No.